Thanks, Dave. Thank you, everyone, for coming today and sharing your lunch hour with us. I'm going to share my screen and I will show you. I've got some slides. We will figure out how to send these at the end. Okay. All right. Everyone good? You can see these? Awesome. All right. I'm going to start with a question, and I want you to just quickly type your answer in the chat and just go with your gut feeling. How does it feel to be graded? Think about maybe you haven't been graded in a while. Maybe you just were graded on an assignment. And I want you to just type that in and I'll read them. Scary, stressful. Okay, nerve-wracking, anxious. I don't enjoy it. Right, so high pressure, yeah. So from what I have gathered, self-conscious, yeah, sometimes you even feel like you're being judged when you're feeling self-conscious about your grading. And no one really likes grading, right? The closest to positive sentiment I got here was okay, which is is not a super positive sentiment when it comes to being graded. Yeah, it's like life, of course. Oh, Vera, it is like life, sort of. So it's not great. And the other thing that I have found is not only do people not like being graded, but if you're on the other side of the table and you're grading, you don't generally enjoy that either. I have never once talked to someone who has said at the end of the semester, I'm doing all of my grading, right? No, they're usually like, I have grading to do. I hate this. This is miserable, right? It's not fun. It's not fun for anyone involved. And so that's sort of where I started my journey. And I'm going to give you a very brief background into how I landed on this movement of ungrading that is happening in the field of education. So in my years of adjunct and now full-time teaching, I have observed that students don't really care about the feedback when it comes to assignments. I would work on the grading, I would give them the grades, and they would look at the grade, and they wouldn't look at any of the feedback that I would spend hours, literally hours, providing to them on their papers and presentations and projects. They would see the grade and they would be like, all right, I'm done, I'm gonna move on. And I would find myself wondering, why am I spending all of this time giving them feedback if they're not even looking at it, if they don't even care? And what they ended up caring was about checking boxes. They just did whatever was required of them to get the grade in the rubric. They would look at the outline and they would say, here are the 5 things I have to do for this assignment. I'm going to do these 5 things. Great, I'm going to be done. Because that's how we've trained people, right? Throughout their entire education process, is to hit the criteria that we as teachers, as professors have laid out for them to hit. But that's not really what I wanted. What I wanted was students to get excited. I wanted questions. I wanted discussion. I wanted critical thinking. I wanted students to geek out with me over the latest marketing campaign or the coolest thing that is happening on TikTok right now, right? Like, I wanted them to get excited about these things with me. And by introducing grading and having them just try to meet these check boxes, I was finding that they weren't getting excited about these things because they were uber focused on what they needed to do, what information they needed to learn in order to get the grade on the next whatever, paper, project, test, etc. I wanted to connect with students, and what I was doing was alienating them. And so I thought there's got to be a better way. I didn't know what it was or how to get there, but I started looking at my teaching practices and overhauling my philosophy, making intentional choices in my courses and curriculum and course design and assignments, and thinking about how can I connect with my students and be more inclusive for people who are coming to the classroom with lots of different areas of experience and skills and knowledge, varying levels, and also varying situations that they're coming from. Not everyone is coming from like middle-class white America. So I needed to make sure that I was decentering that and instead centering all of my other students' experiences. I started looking for alternate assessment options. In my research, I discovered Alfie Kohn. And I don't know if any of you out there, any educators have read anything by Alfie Kohn, but he's written 14 books. He's done a lot of research on education, but also parenting and human behavior. So lots of really interesting things to me because I have a 3 and a 5-year-old. So I'm also interested in parenting. But what I found from the articles that I'd read by Alfie is that grading seemed broken. So he wrote this: research shows that there are 3 reliable effects when students are graded. And I linked to the article here if you want to read more. He's got all of the research that he uses to inform this cited. 1, they tend to think less deeply. 2, they avoid taking risks. And 3, they lose interest in learning itself. Well, I don't know about you, but those are 3 things that I definitely don't want to happen in my classroom. I want students to think deeply. I want them to take risks, because how are they going to learn, especially in college where it's supposed to be this environment where they can practice and fail and try again before they get out into the real world, even though they are in the real world. And I certainly don't want my students to lose interest in learning in itself, because after college, you have to keep learning. It's not like you finish college and you're like, all right, that's it, I'm done. That's all there is to know about life. I know it all, I'm done learning, right? You don't, that's not a thing. So it's really important that my students learn how to love learning itself, so that when they are in their first full-time job or they're promoted into a new position, that they will be able to find something that sparks their interest and make them excited about it. We have to teach our students to be learners, not just students. And that is a distinction, I think, that is important when it comes to thinking about grading and the environment in which, we teach them how to be good students. Here are the things you have to do and check off. But instead, we want to teach them how to be learners. And sometimes that doesn't fit in a nice and easy 3x3 box. So because of all of this, I thought about, well, grading is broken. I couldn't connect to students the way I wanted to. We were in the middle of a pandemic where students were stressed and exhausted and depleted and burnout. They were anxious, they were depressed, they were comparing themselves to other social media highlight reels and falling short because everyone just shares their highlights on social media. They were expected to meet expectations that were difficult to meet prior to the pandemic. And now those expectations really felt impossible. Students didn't feel like they were enough. And I was grading them and telling them they weren't. So in the midst of all of this, in my research, okay, and when I say research, let's be clear, this is not technical academic research. This is I'm reading what people are writing on Twitter, and I'm having conversations, and I'm searching on Google, and I'm reading articles. Some of them are published articles, but I'm also just talking to other educators in the field. And what I discovered was ungrading. It isn't the solution. There's no easy solution to anything, right? But it was a small solution that was in my control and my little corner of the world that I could enact. It was a way to take the emphasis off of comparing students against each other and each other's works and accomplishments and ideas, a way to slightly decrease the anxiety and exhaustion that they're feeling, a way to provide an environment of grace and empathy and trust, and a way to increase their learning, increase their interest in learning, their ability to take risks, and their joy in learning new things. And it was a way that I could reconnect with students. So you may be wondering, what is ungrading? What is it actually? So this is the definition of ungrading as defined by Jesse Stommel, who is one of the most published educators on the topic of ungrading. He's been doing it for over 20 years. Before this was like a whole thing that got popular. And he was an adjunct, a full-time professor in workshops and training. So let me read it to you. Ungrading means raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice, distinct from simply not grading. The word is a present participle, an ongoing process, not a static set of practices. So I just want to call out a couple of things here. First, raising an eyebrow. I really like the way that he has that phrase, because that's what I had started doing when I was looking at grading at my teaching practices. I started raising an eyebrow and saying, how is this working? Is this working? Is there a better way to do this? It's not just not grading, because there's a lot that you have to put into place. If you take away the grades, you have to then seriously consider, well, how do we foster this environment of learning without the carrot or the stick, grade as the extrinsic motivation. And then it's also not a static set of practices. So it's going to look different for me than Jesse, than other educators who do this in the field, because we are all different people. We all have varying teaching philosophies and practices. We have different students. We are teaching in different places. And because ungrading is really centering the student experience and centering the student learning journey, you have to work with the students on this in your classrooms. And so I started realizing in the process of raising my eyebrows at grading that I really view teaching as a form of activism. And so I'm going to share this brief philosophy of my own that I have worked on over the last year and a half, and how ungrading sort of fits into that. And then after this, I'm going to talk about what did and didn't work, very specifics, and then some key takeaways. So in my teaching activism, there are three main areas where I fight for connection with my students. And I fight for social justice and for equity. One, this is my chance to show students, because I teach marketing, that they can change culture, they can change society, they can change norms and values and opinions with their marketing. It's not simply just about selling products. And marketing is a really powerful tool that companies can use to create conversations where there may not have been some. Think about the famous Nike Colin Kaepernick ad, right? That created a lot of conversation. And it's a way for my students to recognize that they can make intentional choices. They can use their voice in their marketing, even with their colleagues, and how they talk about issues, how they talk about brands, how they use their messaging and their words. Every person can make a difference, and marketing is a great way for students to fight for equity. Two, I get to be part of dismantling systemic racism, inequality, and oppression that students have experienced throughout their lives through the grading and overall education process. Ungrading provides people who are neurodiverse, LGBTQ, disabled, female, Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian, and other minoritized groups the opportunity to reflect on and value their work, which may look and sound different than the white male middle-class norm to which we have set our standards against. But it is equally as valid. Ungrading helps to recognize that all learners' experiences are central and significant if it is conducted as part of a holistic teaching practice that decentralize our white norms. Three, I can be part of a movement in education that emphasizes learning over grades. Learning is more important than the grades. And that is something that I have told my students, something I wish that I was probably told, but I didn't let sink into me until I was out of college and realized, really, my grades didn't matter. What matters is that I know these skills and concepts, and I'm competent in these things in my job. And so I'm emphasizing learning over grades. I'm fighting back systems that disconnect me from my students. The students are centered in their learning journey, not me. And we have open conversations about how they see themselves as it relates to grades, and therefore, as it relates to a larger system of education as a whole. We co-create as a class an environment where they're not going to run themselves ragged to finish an assignment or try to get an A on a test and then not remember anything after the fact. And I get to model trying things, failing, and trying again. As you'll see, I did a lot of things that didn't work. And so this process to me is a great way to show the process of trying new things and failing and trying again. And that is one of the things that I really wanted my students to understand in this process of ungrading, is that it's unfair of me to expect them to get something right the very first time they try something. It's unfair of me to expect them to understand the concept the very first time they try to write about it. And it's unfair of me to expect myself to get this right the first time I try it. And so what happened was I tried some things. I got rid of them mid-semester if they didn't work, or I got rid of them and I'm not going to do it again this semester. And I'm not afraid of failure, because it only means that I can continually improve my teaching. So this next slide, these next couple slides are very text heavy. This is not, I don't like this, but in order for, just wanted to have that disclaimer. But in order for you, in case you want to look back at this in the future, it is probably going to be helpful for you. So here are some of the things that I did that over the semester, and I'm going to talk about each of these items and what worked and what didn't. So I dove right in, and that worked. I did a lot of reading before I went into full ungrading mode. And I did a lot of research, of talking to people and reading articles written by Jesse and others, and making lists of ways to do it and brainstorming. And eventually I realized that there was only one way to do it, and it was just to actually do it. So diving right in works. I recommend that. The thing that I built my class around once I got rid of grading, because they still have to have a grade at the end of the semester, right? They still have to have some kind of grade for their final transcript. So even though I didn't grade anything of theirs, they still needed something. So I built my class around these self-reflections where students graded themselves. Middle of the semester and end of the semester, they did this. Middle of the semester was more of like a check-in, and then the end of the semester was their final grade. And in these self-reflections, they talked about the work that they had done or not done in the class, how they engaged with the material, how they engaged with their classmates, how they added to the class discussion, how they brought in their own unique ideas and experiences, and how they applied what we were learning to outside the classroom. And they talked about each of their assignments that they did, and they also talked about more broader things of like what worked about this assignment, what didn't work about this assignment, to sort of force them to think about the process instead of just thinking about the actual finished product. And these were wonderful. I'm doing it again, spoiler alert. And I really enjoyed seeing inside the minds of some of my students who wanted to share with me some of their struggles. And I say on the reflection, you are welcome to share as much or as little information that you feel comfortable with sharing as it relates to how you interacted with this outside of classroom. But students felt like it was a safe environment. So I would have students share about how they were diagnosed with depression or anxiety in the middle of the semester, and how they were dealing with mental health issues, how some of them had COVID, and some of them felt like this self-reflection process gave them room to breathe and not be stressed about getting better, so they could get their work done, but instead just like getting better, right? So the thing that didn't work about these self-reflections is that at the end, when students graded themselves, the students that graded themselves there were students who graded themselves more harshly than their peers who did sort of the same work. And what I noticed about these students who graded themselves a little bit more harshly were that they were women, or they were students who were Black or Latinx. And I don't have an answer for you as to why that is, because I have not yet dug into the research. My gut, right? Here's my gut. Here's my assumption, is that they've been told that they have to work twice as hard to get to where other people are. They've been told that they have to be modest about their work and they can't brag. Maybe they had an educator in the past tell them that they weren't smart or they weren't good enough or whatever. Maybe they came from families that would like, if you aren't perfect, if you're not perfect, if you're not perfect, then it's not good enough. I don't know. And I'm sure that there are people who are who can answer this better than I can. But it is a phenomenon that I noticed, and one that I was disheartened to see, honestly. And that is something this time around because I'm ungrading again, this time around, I talked about it very upfront with my students. And I said, ungrading gets rid of my biases because I'm not grading you. So I'm not perpetuating my own biases. But the problem is you have your own against yourself. And so you need to think about that and wrestle with that, and try to be gentle with yourself. So that was a problem with the self-reflection that I saw. But overall, they worked really well. I think just more discussion is needed around that process. I use Slack and VoiceThread, which are online community tools, and I'm not going to go into detail about what they are and how they work. I'm happy to talk with you afterwards about that. But in order purpose of time, I will keep it simple. But they're online community tools, and they worked really well for allowing my students who are in my online section to connect with each other and to offer their insights into the class. Many students in my evaluations commented about these tools and how effective they were, because they felt like they weren't just sort of floating off by themselves in this class, but instead they had this community of learners who were wrestling with and talking about these concepts with them. They liked it because it was a little bit more informal, a little bit less stuffy, one of them said, than the Moodle forums, because you can do it on your phone. You can just like you're texting almost, you can just do it in these tools. Well, VoiceThread is more desktop, but so that worked really well. And anytime I'm going to have an online course, I will use them in the future. I reworked, cut back on, and gave choices in assignments. So in order to allow my students to be centered in the learning process, in order to give them back some power in this class, or let them take the power, which I asked for their choices in assignments. So you can do this assignment as a paper or a presentation. You can do this one. I don't care how you get me the information, as long as you post it in Moodle. It could be Google Doc, it could be Word. You could just like type it up in Moodle. I just need to know that you are understanding these concepts. And they liked that because some of them chose to use as their strength. So some of them really liked using video, so they did video. Some of them chose it to improve something that they wanted to work on. And so some of them would send me videos because they wanted to practice their presentation skills. And it was a great way for students to tailor the learning experience a bit to their own interests and goals. I cut back a little too far on assignments. So this was the area that was the biggest issue for me, I think, in my ungrading journey, is that last spring, I did this in the spring, and it was, we were all tired. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're all still tired. But I thought, I'm going to cut back, and I'm only going to use assignments and projects that are really important and fun. And what that did was I got rid of my consistent touch points with my students to understand how they were grasping the concepts and engaging with the material. So I got rid of it as a way to not police them. I didn't want them to feel like I was trying to make sure that they were getting things done on time. But then I didn't know if they were understanding what I was talking about in class. So that was a problem when I got to the end of the course, and I had some students who graded themselves A's, and I thought, I don't know if you really got everything, but I also don't have any information that says that you didn't. So I can't negotiate this grade with you because I don't have any conflicting information to the contrary. So this semester, I'm definitely incorporating more consistent assignments. I did an essay, and for those of you, it's apparently this is like a whole phrase now but I did an essay, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this was delightful. This was my favorite part of the whole class. this was a way, it's basically just a fancy word for allowing students to pick their topic of interest in the course and to do their project of however they want to do their project. So middle of the semester, they had to do some research. They had to make an argument and then find research that supported that argument in a very, it's not a real lit review. It was a very like lit review 101 basic, where they found the articles and they gave me a summary of how this was relevant and how they're going to use it in their final projects. So then their proposal was, here's my argument, here's the research that supports it, and here's the format that I'm going to do my final project in. The final project was where they actually supported their argument. So I said, you can do whatever you want. You can choose your format of, and they were outstanding. I had a student who painted a piece of artwork. I had poetry. I had a comic. I had two students do a podcast together. I had presentations and papers. I had one student who wrote a ethical manifesto on marketing dilemmas and how she will approach them in the future. I had a student write a marketing plan for his business that he runs. Just really wonderful, delightful projects that I would have never gotten if I told them that they had to write a paper about consumer behavior. Never. And they took these and they probably spent way more time on them than they would have if I just given them a paper, honestly. I had students in their reflections talk about how they spent the one who painted like hours and hours and hours on this piece of art for the project. Just, I will do it again. I will do it again in a heartbeat. And it was my favorite thing that came out of this class. I here's the spoiler, it didn't work, weekly check-in declaration quizzes, which was a way for students to check in and say, I did the reading this week, I participated in Slack, I talked in class, whatever. And it was less of a way for me to like make sure that they were doing all the work and more of a way for them to keep track for themselves. Well, what I found was they didn't want to do this. It felt like busy work to them. They know whether or not they did the work. So why do they have to tell me? Why do they have to report back to me if they're the ones who are ultimately going to reflect on their experience and grade themselves? So I got rid of those, and I'm not gonna do it again. I had a lot of peer review opportunities, and I'm going to do a lot more of that in the future. And what I found, here's what worked about it. Students really liked it because they liked hearing what their peers found really interesting. And some of these topics, some of these essays that they did really sparked a lot of discussion among the students. One of them talked about body image and advertising and how harmful advertising can be. And there was a lot of discussion in Slack around that when they were giving their feedback. What didn't work is that I think you're going to find this in general when you do ungrading, you need to have a lot of discussions around the process and the way to do it, because students are used to grading. They're used to knowing what to do and check the boxes, but they're not used to this self-reflective process on like, oh, I have to now peer review and I have to think about what this means for my peers. And that is something that I am building more of, like here's how you can do a peer review, because some students have never been taught. They've just been told do a peer review and they don't have any sort of guiding questions to answer. And then finally, I had a lot of discussion around the intent of the assignments because I paired the assignments back. So I inherited this course. I've inherited all of my courses. I haven't been able to just create something from scratch. So I inherited a lot of assignments. Some of these assignments were like 10-point assignments that went into a bucket of 100 that students needed. And there was really no intent. There was no reason for it other than to just give them more points to earn for the class. And I got rid of a lot of those. And so when I talked about my assignments, I would tell my students, the reason I'm having you do this is because I want you to learn this, this, and this. The reason I'm having you work as a group is because you're going to have to do it out in your job. You have to learn how to navigate these conversations. And I know it's hard and we're in a pandemic and you're virtual, but you know what, lots of teams work virtually, and so you have to figure out how to do that. And I was very clear about my expectations of like, here are the things that I want you to learn from this assignment. What I found is that discussion around the intent of the assignment, even though when I was telling the students, here's my intent, they sort of were just like looking at me, you know, like they didn't, and I wasn't getting much feedback. In my evaluations, I had multiple students talk about how I designed the course intentionally, like they use those words, and how I had reasons for doing things and why I had reasons for doing things. And so they got it, they understood, and they appreciated that I had thoughtfully planned out my course so that they can walk away with the skills and knowledge and competencies that they need. Whew. Okay, so that was a lot. I'm going to briefly talk about what I changed, very briefly, because I talked a lot about that here already. And then I'm going to go into a couple of key takeaways. So now that I've done a lot of reading about ungrading, I've now sort of shifted into, I'm still reading about inclusive pedagogy and anti-oppressive teaching practices, but I'm also trying to read more about effective learning and memory recall. Like, what is going to make this stick with the students? Because we're not, unless you have an education degree, we're not taught that, right? We have to sort of like figure that out and learn on our own if you're in higher education. So I have learned in my readings, I actually have it behind me, Small Teaching by James Lang. He writes a lot about some evidence-based practices in education. And one of those things is that quizzes and tests work, they work. And so how can I incorporate that without grading them? So I've included Google Forms as this like weekly formative quiz, where each week I quiz them on the concepts that they learned last week. And it reminds them, oh yeah, right, we talked about this last week. Some of them are like, oh yeah, I forgot about that already. And so it's just another way to ingrain the concepts in their mind without having them be stressed or anxious about a quiz. And they actually do pretty well because they have the time, and I let them talk to their classmates. And then there are discussions like, but I had one last week where students were like sort of arguing like, no, it's this, no, it's this. And they were like teaching each other. That's what I want. That's what you want to happen in a classroom, right? Like you want them to get excited about things. So that's something that I've incorporated. I talked about more consistent assignments. Here's the big change. So I instead of just the reflection documents, I have this performance appraisal format of reflections, because once they're in the industry, they're going to have performance appraisals. So I consulted with a couple of ad agencies locally, and Butler, Till, and Dixon Schwabel, and they gave me their performance appraisals for their employees. And I modeled these performance appraisal reflections. This is actually from an idea I had. Lindsay Groves and I have had coffee. She's on this call. Have had coffee a couple of times to talk about teaching, because we're both pretty new at this. And this was sparked from a conversation we had where I was like, well, why don't we just give our students performance appraisals? Because this is what's going to happen. And so I'm going to give them feedback, but they're also going to go through and say, I got this competency. I understood it. I understand this competency. I got it. This one I'm not very clear on yet. And here's how I'm going to get there. So at the beginning of the semester, I had them create goals for themselves for the semester. And we're going to check in mid-semester and end of semester. And they're going to grade themselves again, but it's going to be a little bit more of a structured performance appraisal format. I added a little bit of minimal grading back in on a scale to give students, not as a way to judge whether or not they hit all the requirements, but more of a way of like, you got this concept, you applied it correctly, you understand. Because what I did find is that students needed that feedback of like, am I getting it? Am I not getting it? So I added that in. Seems to be working so far. I've only done it on one assignment, but the students who got the check minus revised their work and sent it back to me because they legitimately wanted to figure out and understand the concepts versus like, I'm just doing it to get a better grade. So that was really encouraging to see. And then many more open conversations about grading. Okay, so EB question number 1. So what? And the EV question number one is, those of you who know Dr. and Mrs. Elvira Berry, who is on this call, I think, or was, yeah, I see her now, has always asked, so what? So what? Why does it matter? What are you going to do with it? What are the implications? So here's my so what. Here's my key takeaways. It starts with trust. And that is something that I've learned through this journey, is that it starts with trusting yourself. It starts with trusting your students, your employees, your children. It starts with trusting that you and others are doing the best you can with the resources that you have. And it starts with giving people the benefit of the doubt. So that's the sort of framework that I want you to think within, is that you have to trust people. I know after years and years of being in a manager role, of being in a professor role, of being whatever, you start to get cynical, but you have to keep trusting. You have to keep trusting that the majority of people are going to do, they're doing the best that they can. So personal growth, don't be afraid to fail. Life is a constant state of improvement, of revising, of trying again. And as we all know, we're not graded on the most important things like friendships and marriage and parenting, and it's never done. For those of us who are straight A students like me, it's really hard to not be able to just like grade yourself on these things. And it's really hard to accept that you're constantly going to be working on them. But it's okay, because you fail and you can try again. Secondly, people are complex, and treat them as such. Give them the trust that they need in order to thrive. If you start out on a footing of trust with other people, you're going to start out leaps and bounds ahead in the relationship. Something that I've learned from teaching is that generally students, for example, a student who shows up and then falls asleep halfway through my class is not because he's being rude or she doesn't care about what I'm trying to say. It's because they were up all night taking care of a sick child, or because they're overwhelmed and they're trying to keep their grade point average above a certain level to keep their scholarship so they're not sent back home to a hurtful environment. So it's really important to think about all of the different complex things that are affecting the people that you are working with, and treat them as such. And then be reflective. Question why you do things the way that you do. Question your biases, your assumptions, acknowledge them. We all have them, all of us. And consider how you might perpetuate and contribute to systems of oppression, of white supremacy, of racism, sexism, ableism in large and small ways, and try to root those out so you can continue to do better. So teaching, a lot of what I talked about is very applicable to teaching, of course. So the biggest thing I wanted to note here is that if you don't want to jump into ungrading, there are lots of ways that you can move to more minimal forms of grading. And you can use scales. I'm not going to read them all, but you can read them. But there are lots of ways that you can move into this. And if you want to talk to me about any of them, please feel free to contact me afterwards and we can talk. But in the least, if you keep your grading, if that works for you, then make sure you have open discussion about grading in your class and talk to your students about the system that you're using and how it might affect them. And then always give room for a reflection. If you add in a short process reflection on an assignment to hear about what they liked about the assignment, what they didn't like, what they learned, what they could do more of, you'll learn a lot about the way that the assignment is interacting with your students and the way that they're interacting with it, and how you might do it differently or not. Maybe it's great and you need to just keep it the way it is. For managers, feedback early and often. No, and I think about feedback with my students and how I needed that more consistent feedback. You need that in managing too. Make sure you have open discussion around assessment. Give yourself room for reflection. You'll see that's a constant theme in my takeaways. And then in parenting, allow and encourage failure. It is so hard when my 3-year-old wants to buckle her car seat and she's taking 20 minutes and I'm already late. It is so hard to let her fail. And I just want to do it for her. But she's going to learn how to do it if she sits there and tries it. And she's going to learn persistence if I just give her the space to do it. And so with parenting, with even managing, with teaching, allow and encourage that failure, because eventually they'll get it if they keep trying. Listen and believe their feelings. Yeah, okay, I may feel like it's ridiculous that my 5-year-old wanted the pink cup and he got the blue cup. But if I just acknowledge that and say like, whew, you're having a hard time with this, and talk it through and have open discussion around that very small thing, it will help him feel validated and part of our family, instead of just being told what to do all the time. And then that's part of the room for reflection. So I wanted to just close with a couple of comments from students. I'm not going to read all of these, but I will read the second one. At first, it was hard for me. How will I know I'm doing well enough? How will I know if my work is liked? But now I feel great. It has allowed me to do more personal work and focus on communication and feedback, which is ultimately more helpful than any letter grade, and I appreciate it way more. This was anonymous, so I don't know who this was, but they sure understood. They sure understood it. That was one of my favorites, because that's what I'm trying to get at, is that feedback is more important than your letter grade. And then finally, I could talk about this topic for hours. I had to cut this way back just to fit it in here today, but I'm leaving you with a lot of resources. So if you want to keep learning more and exploring more, there's lots here, and Michelle will send out the slides and information with you too. My hope is that my talk today will be a spark for you, the beginning of a fire that will begin to burn away some of the hierarchy and oppression and structural issues related to grading. And I hope that you will read more about this and start to think about your own teaching practices and philosophy to make your own little corner of the world a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more grace and trust filled. Thank you. And I will take questions.
Appreciate Meg. And then we have just a few minutes. We do want to get you back to work or the classroom in time by 1 o'clock, but we do have a few minutes. So you can either put a question for Meg in the chat, or you can type your question into, so you can type it into the chat box, or you can unmute your microphone and I will call on you, and you can ask your question. So I'm looking around. And if I don't call on you, we have pretty small groups, so you could just unmute yourself and say your question. We will empower you.
I have a question from Irv in my chat that asked, I've done this with traditional undergrad students. Is this something I've also done with adults? And if there are any differences you noted. I have not done this with adults yet. I will be in a month when I teach my first business management course, and I will be happy to report back to you how it works. I plan on doing a lot of the same kinds of things, of having often reflections and consistent reflections, and having an open discussion about grading.
And I see that Cassie is unmuted. So go ahead, Cassie, and ask your question of your friend Meg.
Hi, Meg Hartman. I am curious if you had any issues with people just not turning in assignments or not participating. Did you give them was there any grading in that sense that they still had to complete everything asked of them, or how did you handle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there were, everyone eventually turned in everything by the end of the semester. I had one student who had an incomplete because she was dealing with some mental health issues. And so I gave her a couple weeks until after the semester was over to turn everything in. But because of the way that the class is set up, I don't have any sort of consequences or hard deadlines for late assignments. And I encourage the students, like, this is a best by date, right? So like, in order to stay on track with the work and not get overwhelmed, you need to turn your assignments in. And 95% of them would turn it in on time every time. And the ones that didn't usually were they weren't taking advantage, but they were using it because they were stressed or tired or overwhelmed or had COVID or had mental health issues, and they would turn it in usually within a week. So it wasn't usually a problem. I also tell them that if they turn it in too late, they're just really digging themselves a hole, and they need to figure out how to do the work in order to understand the assignments. So we talked about that too. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure I will run into that the more I do this, but I haven't entirely yet.
Great, thank you, Meg. Someone else who has a question? This is such a new idea for many of us, or maybe others have tried some of these things in their classroom or their home or their work environment. Anyone have a question or something else they want to share? Okay, so yeah, so Joy is asking if what level were these seniors, or how old were these students, Meg, that you talked about for this class?
Mostly juniors and seniors. There were a couple sophomores. And right now it's the same sort of thing. So I haven't done this with any freshmen. I know that educators who have done it with freshmen say that it works well. You just have to, again, continually like have these discussions with them and provide a little bit more hand-holding. And so instead of just saying like, here are the assignments, maybe work with them on how to get the work done in time.
Right. Thank you. So Evangeline is asking, how well did your students' assessments of how well they did match with your internal assessment of how they did? You did share that one example, but in general, did they typically match up, or what did you do if they didn't?
Yeah, they typically matched up, and they were honest. I found my students were honest, and I had some students who were like, I didn't do any of the reading. And so I didn't find that I needed it, or it's hard for me to read. So I just didn't do it. And so I'll give myself a B instead. But like, they understood the concepts, they engaged with the material. And you know what, if you don't have to do the reading and you get it, I'm not gonna really like be mad at you for it, because if you understand and you can do everything that you need to do by the time this class is over, then great. But in general, students usually need to do the reading at some point. But yeah, like in general, they lined up pretty well. And like I said, there were a couple of students at the end who I was like, I don't know if that quite, but because I didn't have that consistent checkpoint, I didn't have anything to negotiate. And I have in my reflection and in my performance appraisal, I reserve the right to raise or lower your grade. And more often than not, there were multiple students that I had to raise the grade, not lower it.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. Okay, I see Wayne. Yes, please go
My
right
question is a follow-up to that, and that is, were the students provided some definition of what an A grade might look like or would include, or a delta grade or whatever it would be, you know? Or do we just assume everybody knows what A, B, C, D represents, and so you assign yourself a letter?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
But that's enough to put the question to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I got excited. So I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I got excited by your question. No, we worked together as a class to define what an A level work means, what B level work means. I started with assumptions in my syllabi and said, here's what A level work looks like, here's what B level work. And then they looked at it and they said, this seems fair. This doesn't quite seem fair. I think I might move a couple of things. And we worked on it together as a class. But yeah, we definitely had expectations of, you know, A level work looks like doing the work and doing it thoughtfully and engaging with it, that sort of thing. Yeah, you definitely have to have that, so you can give them some sort of like, you know, guidelines of how to grade themselves. Otherwise, right, like you can be like, I feel like I liked this class, so I'll give myself an A. Like, so yeah, good question.
Great, thank you. We have 7 minutes. Who else has a question or a thought or has tried something? Yeah, Dr. Cullum.
Meg, thank you for this presentation. I'm fascinated and scared. I feel pressure because one of my students, your friend, is in my class right now, and I know what she's going to be thinking. Sorry. But anyway, I want to know if the literature or if you have any concerns or questions about integrity of academic credit. So if in the instance of a student where she or he did not read the material, but was able to grasp the concepts anyway, and if my academic credit is based on time on task, the old-fashioned Carnegie unit.
Mhm.
How is this different then from a competency-based course, which we're of course not accredited to do right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a full answer for that. I have thought about that a little bit. What my the specific student that I'm thinking of who said they didn't do the reading, they instead looked up videos and watched videos on the content instead to like sort of understand it. So I didn't provide any of the video links, but they went out and like searched it because they didn't want to read, but they couldn't figure out. So I assume that it'll sort of wash out in the end, because if they're not doing the reading, they have to figure out somewhere. And so they may be talking to students in the class, or they may be talking to me during my office hours, or some other way of understanding this. I don't think that some of these concepts, they have to figure out where it is and how to apply it somehow. So but that is a good question, and probably something that I should look a little more closely at.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. We probably have time for one last question or comment. Don't be shy. Meg's had a really unique experience. I really appreciate her responsiveness to student needs, wanting to provide them with an excellent education, but also recognizing the unique challenges of the time. Any other thoughts from you? Yes, Dr. Berry.
Yes. So just following up on Dr. Cullum's observation, I suspect that there are some areas of study which lend themselves more directly to what Meg is talking about than others. And when it's a hands-on product that you're going to end up with, there's a lot of good stuff here.
Mm-hmm.
How that translates, whether it should translate into, you have to know some stuff in order to be able to think about that and eventually see the implications or the so what of the material. And so the difficulty, I think, is the one I wrestle with all the time. And Meg, you're a major, you know that, it's, how do you make the material significant enough so that learning it is important for the student in order to move on to do other things, in order to build a foundation. And the foundation, I think, is harder to measure or to deal with in the way that you're talking about doing that. At the same time, I think the attitude toward learning, which I share, that learning is learning.
Yes.
Is something that we all need to wrestle with. And how to do that and how to best do that remains an ongoing question, which keeps this kind of life exciting, of course, though sometimes frustrating. Anyway, there's my observation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it is likely more difficult in some fields than others to do this. I know this is often done in more of the humanities kind of courses because it's easier to have discussions and wrestle with implications. And whereas like in STEM fields, it is done. There are people who are doing this in STEM fields, but you have to be even more intentional and even more thoughtful of how you do this, because eventually they will be taking tests in order to be certified, right? So you have to be able to prepare them for that too. So I can't speak to that part of it because I'm not in STEM. God bless the people who are. And but yeah, it is a good observation to think about how it might apply in different areas of study.